Hello my friends, in today's video we will be comparing Sony A7IV and Fujifilm X-H2S. The competition in this price range was quite boring for a pretty long time. Full-frame cameras have mostly caught up with the crop cameras in terms of the feature set, so high-end APS-C cameras didn't make that much sense. That might no longer be the case after the introduction of XH2S. In this video, we will compare the performance and the feature set of A7IV and XH2S, and I will try to help you decide which way to go. The size of A7IV and XH2S is very similar. Fujifilm is a little bit wider, but the difference is hardly noticeable. The weight difference is just 2 grams, both weigh around 660 grams including a battery, so both are exceptionally compact and light considering what they can do. Both use a magnesium frame and feel very solid. I would say that the XH2S might have very slight advantage because the front side is rubberized, but I don't have any complaints about the A7IV build quality either. Both cameras are weather sealed. I have tested the weather sealing on A7IV more than I would like, and I can confirm that it will survive pretty strong rain. Judging by the X-T4, I also expect the XH2S to perform very well in this regard. Probably the most important difference is the sensor size and the sensor technology. A7IV uses full-frame backside illuminated 33 megapixel sensor. XH2S uses a smaller APS-C backside illuminated 26.1 megapixel sensor, but it is a stacked or layered sensor. A7IV captures more detail thanks to the higher resolution and lower pixel density, which makes the job a lot easier for the lenses. How much more detail you will be able to see depends on the viewing device. On a 32-inch 4K screen, you can see that Sony images are somewhat more detailed, but unless you zoom in or crop a lot, the difference won't be that huge. If you tend to crop in a lot, Sony will give you more flexibility. 26 megapixels on Fuji is still completely sufficient in my opinion. Comparing the ISO performance is a bit tricky because they use different ISO scales. If you want to match the exposure, you need to use ISO higher by at least 2/3 of a stop on Fuji. That means that we will compare ISO 1600 on Sony to ISO 2500 on Fuji, for example. Sony is generally cleaner by about 1.1 stop. At Sony ISO 1600 and Fuji ISO 2500, Sony is very clean. On Fuji you can clearly see the noise, but it is usable. At Sony ISO 3200 and Fuji ISO 5000, the Sony is still very clean and usable for the majority of publishing platforms. Fuji can probably still be used for online publishing, but the amount of noise is quite significant. At ISO 6400 on Sony and 10000 on Fuji, Sony is still usable for digital publishing. There is a lot of noise on XH2S, so I would only use that in case of emergency. ISO 12800 is an emergency option on Sony, but it still gets the colors right. ISO 25600 is usable for documentary purposes. Overall, Sony wins in terms of the low light as expected. The dynamic range is also a bit better on Sony in the real world. It has base ISO 100 and superior signal-to-noise ratio, so on Sony you can basically use shadows and highlight sliders without restrictions. Base ISO on Fuji is 160, but you will still get a very low amount of noise even with aggressive editing. Unless you need to make a large prints, you shouldn't be limited by dynamic range on Fujifilm either. The colors are pretty similar. There are some differences, but I can't say that one is consistently better than the other. Both are generally accurate, natural, and easy to work with. An advantage of Fujifilm are film simulations, which are an easy way to get an interesting look straight out of the camera. XH2S is significantly faster. Stacked sensor allows it to shoot 40 frames per second with autofocus continuous. Sony can only do 10 frames per second, and that is also limited to 12-bit RAW, but it is not a big deal. 40 frames per second is incredible speed, sufficient for any kind of sports or wildlife shooting. More frames per second means more chances to capture the right moment, so Fujifilm definitely wins in this category. A7IV definitely isn't hopeless when it comes to the sport shooting though. 10 frames per second isn't great by 2022 standards, but it is sufficient for a lot of use cases. An important difference is that Fuji uses electronic shutter to achieve these speeds. Importantly, you can get basically infinite buffer with both cameras. A7IV has unlimited buffer capacity as long as you use CF Express Type A cards. XH2S has unlimited buffer up to 20 frames per second, but at 40 frames per second you will still get 170 shots before slowing down. Both cameras perform like proper flagship with CF Express cards, meaning that you can review the images and change all settings immediately after you have shot hundreds of RAWs. The secondary slot in both cards is SD, so you can't have full speed backup writing. Regarding the autofocus, I won't go too deep into the specifications because Fujifilm now claims 2.16 million autofocus pixels. As far as I know, Sony also uses millions of autofocus pixels, but they only specify 693 autofocus points, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that both performed flawlessly in all of my usual tests, such as close distance focusing, backlit subjects, and low light. When it comes to the tracking, I was able to get a perfect hit rate with a subject walking towards the camera with the XH2S. Overall, I can say that the autofocus will not limit the fast shooting capabilities of the XH2S. You need to use the right settings though. In some tests, especially at f2.8, I was getting some shots that were usable but not 100% in focus. That is where 40 frames per second comes in handy since you have a lot to choose from. With A7IV, I have done multiple runs with different settings and I didn't get a single frame that was not perfectly in focus. It doesn't really care, it got it right every single time, even at f2.8. I obviously haven't tested it at 40 frames per second, but at 10 frames per second the results were perfect. Sony still has the lead in video autofocus. XH2S is a big step forward for Fujifilm though. In a lot of situations the XH2S performs great. The eye tracking in video works really well, for example. The only issue seems to be the focusing from close distance to infinity, where it sometimes hunts, but it also gets dead right on a lot of occasions. Much like with stills, Sony doesn't really care about the situation, it gets it right every time. I've been using the A7IV for about 8 months and I haven't encountered a single situation where the autofocus hasn't worked perfectly. A big advantage of Sony in video are autofocus modes or areas. You can use any of the stills mode and there is also a normal touch tracking. With XH2S you can either have a full sensor automatic area or single point with adjustable size. There is no touch tracking, but it will track faces in video. So how about the video? First of all, both can shoot full sensor downsampled 4K video. XH2S up to 60 frames per second, A7IV up to 30 frames per second. A7IV can also shoot 4K 60p but with 1.5 times crop. Fujifilm can also shoot 4K DCI or 17:9 4K video and OpenGate 6.2K 3:2 video. In terms of the 4K video detail, Sony is a little bit better due to higher downsampling rate and lower pixel density, which again makes the job easier for the lenses. 6.2K is definitely an advantage of XH2S, but if you're exporting in 4K, it won't provide much advantage besides the possibility to crop in. When it comes to codecs, Fujifilm is the winner. It can shoot anything from H.264 to ProRes HQ internally with bitrates from 100 to 2754 megabits per second. All intra 10-bit 422 is available for every resolution and frame rate. A7IV can also shoot 4K in 10-bit 422 up to 60 frames per second. It can do so up to 500 megabits per second in 50p or 250 megabits per second in 25p. I actually use 140 megabits per second long GOP most of the time because the long GOP works great nowadays. Unless you are shooting in log, you don't need a higher bitrate than that. If you are shooting log, those high bitrates on Fujifilm may provide additional information for expanding flat gamma curve. I've got a very good results when shooting log on both, but I haven't done in-depth tests. Fujifilm may capture more dynamic range, but the noise level at the log base ISO on Sony is lower. The codecs on both cameras are more than sufficient for hybrid users. If you need a camera for very serious filmmaking, high bitrates and internal ProRes on Fujifilm may be an advantage, although the full frame look is also desirable in high-end filmmaking. An advantage of Fujifilm is that it can shoot 4K 120p, but it does so with 1.29 times crop and it confirms that to 24 or 25p in camera. Sony also has that additional crop in 4K 60p, but it still uses APS-C sized area to film that, and the image quality is very solid, so I wouldn't hesitate to use this mode at all. One more advantage of the XH2S is that there is very little amount of rolling shutter in video, basically negligible. There is some rolling shutter with A7IV, but it definitely won't ruin your footage in reasonable situations. If you encounter some extreme situations, such as high-speed train passing by, you can still fix a lot by applying rolling shutter repair in post. Overall, both are great video cameras. Fujifilm offers better codecs and 6.2K option, but Sony has that full-frame high-detailed look, so it depends on what you are looking for. Fujifilm claims that the in-body image stabilization in XH2S has 7-stop efficiency. Sony claims 5.5 stops for A7IV. The IBIS in XH2S is better, but definitely not by 1.5 stop. Not because the XH2S IBIS is not good, but because the A7IV IBIS is greatly underrated. With XH2S, I was able to get 1.5 second handheld shots at 24mm full-frame equivalent, and with Sony A7IV I can get about 1 second exposures. In video, the XH2S is also more stable, but the difference is not huge. Both cameras are sufficient for static shots, probably up to 70mm, Fuji a bit more, and normal stuff such as panning or pointing the camera around and getting very stable footage. Both also offer digital stabilization on the top of the IBIS with 1.1 times additional crop, and it is very effective on both. Regarding the handling, interestingly, the grip is almost identical and I definitely don't mind that. I think that it is very good compromise between the holding comfort and compact design, and I think that most users will be happy with it. An advantage of A7IV is that it has 2 more command dials. The placement of the buttons is very logical on both, and I don't have any fundamental issues with the controls layout on either. Fujifilm has 1 extra button on the front side. Basically, the only thing that I miss on both is the dry mode dial. An advantage of Fuji is that it offers 7 custom modes that can be configured as stills or video modes. XH2S has a status display, it is probably the best available and it shows all of the necessary information. I don't use it at all, but if you do, it is an advantage of Fujifilm. The user interface is in my opinion better with Sony. A7IV uses the new main menu, which is very well structured and it can be controlled by the touchscreen. XH2S uses the traditional Fuji menu, which is also pretty well structured but not as well as Sony, and it can't be controlled by the touchscreen at all. FN or Q menu is great on both, it offers unlimited customization and touch controls on both cameras, so no complaints there. Overall, I like the handling on both, but I slightly prefer the A7IV because of those 2 extra dials and better main menu. The display is better on XH2S. Both cameras use a 3-inch 3x2 panel, but the Fujifilm has higher resolution at 1.62 million dots. Sony uses 1.4 million dot panel, but it is not as bad as that number would suggest. It is still usable, but Fujifilm display is better for reviewing the photos and for manual focusing. The viewfinder on Fujifilm uses 5.76 million dot panel with 0.80 times magnification. This EVF is a class above Sony's 3.69 million dot panel with 0.78 times magnification. The EVF in A7IV is still very good, but that extra resolution is definitely nice to have. NP-FZ100 battery in A7IV is slightly larger at 2280 mAh. XH2S uses 2200 mAh battery. Both cameras are rated for 580 shots. Sony's battery life is a little bit better in the real world. During my testing, it consumed 45% of the battery, whereas the Fujifilm consumed 61%. The battery life on both cameras is excellent. You can get well over 1500 shots on a single charge depending on the usage. Sony still dominates when it comes to the lens selection. E-mount lens selection is in my opinion the most complete on the market. There is plenty of brilliant budget-friendly lenses from brands such as Samyang, Tamron, Sigma, and so on. Some of the latest Sony lenses such as the 24-70mm GM2 offer optical perfection in a miraculously small and light package as long as you are willing to pay for it. Fuji lens selection is not bad, but a lot of first-party lenses are due for an update. Some of the latest Fuji lenses, such as 18mm f1.4, are great and most likely ready for a 40 megapixel sensor. Third-party options are getting much better as well. Especially Viltrox and now also Sigma make very interesting budget-friendly alternatives, but there is still a lot that I miss in the system. To sum up, there won't be a clear winner this time. Actually, both cameras are winners for their target audience. Sony A7IV is a well-rounded full-frame hybrid camera. Fujifilm X-H2S finally does what high-end cameras are supposed to do. It compensates for having a smaller sensor by offering a specific feature set. Sony's output is ultimately better in terms of the detail, dynamic range, and ISO performance. Fujifilm is a much faster camera thanks to that stacked sensor. A7IV's autofocus system is still better since it is pretty much perfect, but the autofocus on XH2S is getting pretty close to Sony. In-body image stabilization is better on Fuji, but Sony actually isn't very far. Fujifilm has more advanced codecs and video specs, but the A7IV has that desirable full-frame look. Sony has slightly better handling and user interface, Fujifilm has better display and EVF. An important decision-making factor might also be the lens selection, where Sony dominates at the moment. At the end of the day, I think that A7IV's advantages are more accessible to the majority of users, but I am pretty sure that the XH2S will be a popular camera among the users that can take advantage of its incredible speed. I am very happy that we are once again in the situation where we have the choice between the full-frame sensor and special features. The choice between these two cameras should be pretty easy based on what you intend to do with it, and I hope that this video will help you make the right choice. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.